Welcome back to our third and final part of the VBT Coach Velocity Logbook walkthrough. So in the first part, just to recap, if you haven't watched, we looked at that contextual piece. So collecting all your velocity data for all your exercises across all your weights, and then seeing how you're performing compared to your 7 and your 30-day average. A really valuable real-time tool that you can use in the gym to help with your training. Now remember, this tool is mobile friendly, so you can use this on your phone, enter the numbers as you're training, so just go between your velocity-based training app, like Metric, and your spreadsheet on the Google Sheets app on your phone, and you can enter these numbers and get that context. The 30-day average in particular, I find really powerful to see whether I'm trending in the right direction. Most weeks, most sessions, I want to beat that 30-day average. If I'm a lot behind that 30-day average, that's a bit of a red flag, that's a bit of a concern. The next thing we looked at in part 2 was we looked at progress by weight. So on this sheet here, you just enter the name of the exercise. In this example, we used a trap bar deadlift. Enter the weight that you want to look at, and you can then track on the graph there your velocity on your best rep over time. So it just pulls in all the dates you might have done that 90 kilo deadlift, and then the rep number, and then the best rep velocity of that set. And what we learned in part 2 was that the 26th of the 11th, this session here, was a really good day. We set velocity PBs on almost every single weight. So that was a day when we were moving with really good power and probably making really good progress, because we're now 4 weeks into that program, things are starting to build up. What we're going to look at now in part 3, this final part of it, is an extra additional tool that you don't really have to use. So I would strongly recommend use the Velocity Logbook when you're training with velocity, because that contextual data is so valuable and so priceless to help you make good decisions. And you incorporate it with things like your RPE or your percentages to adjust and change your training in real time, just to add those little tweaks to get better results. The third thing we're going to look at though is the profiling. So load velocity profiling is a really common tool that we use in VBT, and it's really what it's doing. It's taking not just a single set and comparing it over time. So say, for example, your trap bar deadlift at 90 kilos and comparing that week on week, but now we're taking an entire session, so from 70, 90, 100, and 110 on that trap bar deadlift, comparing that whole session to the number of sessions in the past. So the profiling tool allows us to take that load, velocity, and in this case, we'll look at power 2 and compare those over time to different sessions. And you can get different scores out of this to then rank the quality of your training, how well you're going, in a more sort of global sense. So what we'll do is let's get a bit of data in here. So the profiling tool, if you head across here, entering their name, so I'll enter mine, Jacob. I'm about 90 kilos at the moment. You'll need your body weight if you want to look at the relative scores. We'll get to them in a second. If you don't care about relative scores, body weight's irrelevant. And then we'll look at, let's stick with the trap bar deadlift because we've been using that so far. So name, body weight, exercise. We then want to look at the MVT, or the minimum velocity threshold. Now this is the number we use to determine your 1RM. So 1RM is the point where your load velocity profile intersects with the minimum velocity threshold. Minimum velocity threshold is pretty fixed and pretty standard for things like a conventional deadlift, a powerlifting style low bar back squat, and a bench press. But for more modified exercises, things like the trap bar deadlift, it's a little more variable. So it's tricky for me to work out what my MVT is, my minimum velocity threshold, because I don't really have one. I haven't really done a max out 1RM on my deadlift and recorded it. So I don't know what that number is. And it would vary by individual. So limb length, height, lifting technique, whether you go off blocks, touch and go style techniques, they will all adjust and change what that minimum velocity threshold is. So we're just going to enter 0.4 because I know it's roughly around that. But you might not use that if you don't care about 1RMs. So if you're not worried about the 1RM profiling tool, which we'll talk about in a second, you don't have to go a minimum velocity threshold. But for this, for illustrative purposes, we'll put in 0.4, which is maybe a bit high, but that'll be fine. Okay, now there's some fake data in here, so let's get rid of that. And let's enter in the weights I did a couple of sessions ago. So 50, 70, 90, 100, 110, 110, and 120. So those were the weights I did. I kind of did a profiling session on this day. So that's why the warm-up gaps are pretty small, and that's why there's a lot of sets. So velocities, let's go ahead and enter those. I don't actually remember them, so I'm just going to put in some fake numbers, roughly around what I sort of hit for these numbers. All right, so we've got velocity numbers. Now you can also enter power numbers. I don't remember mine off the top of my head, so we're just going to enter some fake ones. I think I usually hit about 1,000 watts at 100 kilos, give or take. So let's call that 1,050 and we'll work backwards from that. The power profile is going to be a little bit out today, so don't worry about that. But if you are recording power, enter the precise power numbers. Now you can enter power in either watts per kilo, so do it relative to body weight in these blue cells, or you can just do absolute power. It's up to you. It doesn't matter too much. It'll give you a similar sort of result, just with either a relative score or an absolute score. Okay, so now we've got our data. So we've got my details, my name, my body weight, the exercise, minimum velocity threshold if you care about 1 RM. And then we've got the load, the velocity, and the power profile all in here for these 6 sets on the trap bar deadlift. What happens is the sheet automatically uses that number to spit out a bunch of numbers. There's 6 fixed scores that are calculated automatically when you enter those details. And then there's one more with the power profile that we'll talk about in a second, down a little lower. So the first score we've got is our 1 RM, and it gives you that in absolute terms or relative to body weight. So in absolute terms, that 1 RM is taking the intersection between the load velocity profile and that minimum velocity threshold value. So if I change that to 0.35, you'll notice that my absolute 1 RM increases just a little bit. So we'll leave it at 0.4, because I think about 140 kilos is roughly what I would expect for my 1 RM right now. Then relative, it just takes that relative to body weight. So it takes that 141 and divides it by my body weight of 90 kilos. So 1.6, that's not too bad for me right now. So that's your first one, your 1 RM profile. You could use that to then determine your percentage-based training. So you could collect this profile across, say, maybe your 50, 70, 90 for your warm-up sets, and then use that to determine what your daily 1 RM is, and then do your percentage-based training off that. It's not the best way to use velocity-based training, but if you're used to training with percentages and you work with a percentage scheme, that's a pretty smart way to auto-regulate what your 1 RM is in real time in a daily session to get a better outcome. The next 2 scores are your L0 and your V0. L0 is the score, these are theoretical scores, but they're good ways to track your progress over time. So L0 is the score in meters per second when there is 0 kilos on that trap bar deadlift. Now it's impossible to do a 0 kilo trap bar deadlift because the bar itself weighs 25 kilos, so it's hard to go to 0, but gives you an idea of what you would theoretically lift at 0 kilos in meters per second. So that gives you an idea of your maximum velocity, I suppose, for this movement and this shape. It's theoretical, but it gives you a good idea. And you can track that over time. So L0 might give you a good indication, are you moving your warm-up sets, your light sets, with good intent and good explosiveness? V0, on the other hand, is the opposite. That takes your absolute weight when velocity would be 0. So I suppose it's like kind of like your isometric maximum strength, but again, it's theoretical. It's not actually an isometric strength test. It gives you a theoretical idea of where that load velocity profile would zero out when it comes to the x-axis. So for me, it's 183.2. It's a score in kilos, but really it's just a number, 183. If I do this load velocity profile again in the future, I would hope that that 183 has gone up, which is indicative of increased strength. So that load velocity profile is now extending out further. And same with the V0, you can also take that relative to body weight. So I haven't got that in the spreadsheet, but you can take V0, divide it by body weight and get your score. And for me, 183 at a body weight of 90 is a bit over 2, so it's cool. So you could look at that in relative terms. If my body weight increases, but my V0 doesn't increase, then my relative V0 would go down, which would be a bad thing. Now the next score is called your curve score and your relative curve score. These two are my absolute favorite scores on this entire thing. Curve score is effectively the area of your entire load velocity profile. Curve score takes the entire area of that triangle. So it goes from L0 to V0 and works out the surface area of that triangle. It gives you a really good overall picture of your lifting performance for a single session. Over time, what you should see is your load velocity profile goes up because you lift the same weights faster, or out to the right as you lift heavier and heavier weights and get stronger. So in time, what should happen is that curve score will go up in response to that increased height or increased width of your load velocity profile. So it's that surface area. Even better for me is that relative curve score. So taking that curve score and then relative to body weight, I think that is probably the most valuable number on this entire thing. If you look at your curve score every couple of months relative to body weight, for a given exercise, you should get a really good sense of whether you're making progress overall on an exercise. Yeah, you could lift heavier weights, but if you lift those heavy weights really slow and really grindy, you might not be making as much progress as if you lifted the same weight, but did it more explosive with more speed. So it's about balancing that increased velocity and increase in load and getting the right balance of those two. So there are 6 scores. We've got the 1 RMs, L0 and V0, which are good sort of theoretical maximums, if you will, and then the curve score and the relative curve score, which I think are my absolute favorite scores. If I was only going to track one thing with my load velocity profile, it would be that relative curve score across every exercise. So that's what we can do with the load velocity profile. We can also, because we track power, we can also look at our load power profile, which is down here in blue. And you can see it's a bit of a mess because we use some fake data. But you can see here that we've got this curve here as well. And what, unfortunately, we can't do this automatically, but you can sort of look for the peak point in that curve, look for the load at peak power, which is about 90, maybe 92 kilos in this example. And that could potentially be your training load for your power sets. So maybe you're doing some dynamic effort work or some explosive sets. You might use this on, say, a power clean or a trap bar deadlift, and you can go, okay, well, it's about 92 kilos. So we're going to do a 5x3 cluster set program at 92 kilos so that we know we're training around or very close to peak power. You can also use this as a profiling tool to see what your point of peak power is. So if I take that across, we can see it's somewhere between 750 and 1,000. So it's maybe 825, 850 is the point of peak power on that curve. Now we know, because again, this is fake data, that on the 100 kilo set that we put out 1,000 watts, that number is alone a lot higher than what the profile suggests. But if you had real data, there's a chance the top of that curve would not match one of those dots. So the dots might fall either side of the top of the curve, and so you need to use the curve to estimate where that peak power point is. If someone knows how to make that automatic and to take a polynomial or quadratic formula and get the maximum value on the X and Y axis from that, please let me know in the comments so that I can fix this and make this automatic instead of having to eyeball it on a fuzzy graph like that. Now, the last thing on this sheet, this profiling tool sheet, is some minimum velocity threshold suggestions. So if you're not sure what your minimum velocity threshold is, but you'd like to do it, we've got it down here. So this has three, this minimum velocity threshold suggestions has three different categories or three bands for your bench, squat, deadlift, trap bar deadlift, because it tends to be a bit faster, and a prone row or a bent over barbell row. So novice, intermediate, and advanced. Typically, the more advanced you are, the slower your minimum velocity threshold is because you have more neuromechanical efficiency. You're more able to grind out slower reps and successfully complete the rep than a novice lifter would. Whereas a novice lifter, they kind of give up and their nervous system isn't able to lift as slow and complete the rep. So you can use these numbers as guidelines and then you can punch them in. So what you can do is, maybe Jacob says it's 0.3, put that in, look at your 1RM and go, whoa, there's no way I could do that. Okay, that's probably not my minimum velocity threshold. Adjust it. And for me, we got that pretty right at the start with the 0.4. Yeah, maybe 140. So maybe it's 0.45, 136, something around that is probably my minimum velocity threshold. But that will change over time. As I get stronger, hopefully my minimum velocity threshold gets lower and I'm able to, both in real terms and in estimate and profiling terms, be able to lift a higher 1RM. So once you've done that, once you've gone through that profiling process, like I mentioned, it's optional. I tend to do this after a session, not during a session, unless I'm doing that peak power thing and trying to find my peak power point to train at. But I'll do this after a session. So I'll go to my velocity logbook, I'll copy and paste those numbers into the profiling tool, and then I'll see where I'm at. Maybe once a month, once every couple of months, just to get an idea that that curve score, which is my favorite one to track, is going up for each exercise over time. Now, if you want, you can then take that profile that you've collected and then you can log it over time. So I've got a couple of example sets here, back squat relative to 1RM, bench press for a curve score, and then a row for an L0 score. Just as examples, I'd tend to stick to one score for all three exercises, but you might care about different things with different movements. So for example, if you're doing Olympic lifts, you might care about peak power or maximum power on your power cleans, whereas on your trap bar deadlift and your back squat, you care about curve score. Might be different. And then on your bench, you might care about 1RM because you might do a percentage-based training for a different exercise. But from that, you'll get a trend line and you'll be able to see is your progress going up over time on these scores, and then you can track them over date. So in this example, I'm doing it every 6 months. Start of the year and then start of the financial year, I do a new profile for these exercises and log them in time, and you'll start getting some scores and seeing where you're at. So hopefully that's helpful. That's profiling. It's a little more advanced than just logging things and seeing progress by weight. But the profiling tool is a really valuable thing to use if you do care about those scores and those ways of sort of tracking progress in a more holistic global sense, looking at an entire session instead of just a single set to see if you're making progress. The 1RM tool is pretty valuable if you're a powerlifter and you know what your minimum velocity threshold is. So you can use that to maybe track progress even in a high volume phase. So if you're doing a high volume phase and you're not going after heavy maximum PR type loads, you can still see, are my velocities suggesting that my 1RM is in fact going up? It can be reassuring too to know that and not panic that you're not making the right kind of progress at the right time of year. And then if you're an athlete or just a general trainer, using the curve score or the V0 score is a good way to track progress overall and so give you a score to keep an eye on. So for me, for example, I might want to get that V0 score up to 200. That might be a goal I set myself, or get my relative curve score above 2 in this example. And you can use these scores, particularly the relative ones, as good competitions in the gym. So you can have athletes compete side by side on those tests and on those scores, particularly the relative ones, next to each other to see who can make the most progress and who can push that score the best. Good way to get more intent in your early sets in a session, not just trying to max out the weight every single time you go into the bar. So hope that helps. If you want a copy of this logbook or this profiling tool, head to vbtcoach.com. It's linked below in the description. Get yourself a copy of this. Start using it in your training, whether you use Metric or another VBT training tool, it doesn't really matter. You just go back and forth from the VBT training app into your Google Sheets app, log the numbers, and you can see, start tracking your numbers, start tracking your progress, and see if you want to use that to make decisions in real time, or just to make sure you're heading in the right direction with your training and that your program is in fact effective. Good luck, happy training, and I'll see you later.